The wind across the high plateau of the Arizona Territory had a voice. It was not the whisper of the low desert, but a long, keening cry that scoured the thin snow from the volcanic rock and rattled the bones of the piñon pines. Atza-Nez knew this voice. It was the sound of winter settling in, a sound that demanded respect and patience. He stood at the eastward-facing doorway of his hogan, a solid structure of timber and packed earth that felt more a part of the land than built upon it. The smoke from his small fire curled from the central opening in the roof, a fragile gray thread against the iron-colored sky. He had been a scout for the army, a lifetime ago. He had learned their language, their ways of marching and making war, and he had learned the bitter taste of their promises. Now, he lived as the Dine had always lived, listening to the earth and the sky. He had come here seeking quiet, a place to mend the part of his spirit that the world of the white men had frayed. This land asked only for attention, and in return, it gave solitude. That solitude was broken by a shape moving against the snow. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. It stumbled where a deer would glide. It fought the wind that a wolf would use for cover. It was human, and it was dying. Atza moved from the shelter of the hogan, his moccasins making no sound on the snow-dusted ground. He kept to the cover of the junipers, his eyes trained to see a puff of dust miles away, fixing on the figure. A woman. Her dress was dark and shredded, offering no real protection against the cold that could kill a man in an hour. She fell, pushed herself up with an effort that was plain to see even from a distance, and staggered on. He watched her for a full minute, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest. Trouble. This was the world's trouble walking into his quiet life. He had made a promise to himself to stay apart from it. The last time he had helped, it had led him to guide soldiers against men who were only fighting for their own land. He still saw their faces in his dreams. He would not make that mistake again. She fell again, and this time, she did not get up. She curled into a small knot on the snow, a gesture of final surrender to the cold. The wind tore at her thin clothing, pulling the sound of a sob from her and carrying it to him. The stone in his chest cracked. He could not. He was dying. To see life failing and to turn away was to invite disharmony into his own soul. He moved from the trees, his steps now deliberate and sure. As he drew closer, he saw the details. Her hair, the color of corn silk, was matted with ice. Her face was pale, streaked with frozen tears. Her hands were raw and swollen, a deep, angry red against the white snow. And around her wrists, stark and ugly, were the bruised grooves left by ropes. Someone had done this to her. This was not the work of the mountain or the storm. This was the work of men. She was frozen, exhausted, and crying. The Navajo warrior lifted her gently beside the warm fire. He had not realized he had made the decision until he was already moving, scooping her from the snow. She weighed almost nothing. She murmured something, her breath a white puff, but the words were lost. He carried her back to the hogan, his long strides eating up the distance. Inside, the warmth was a physical presence. A small fire of juniper wood burned in the center pit, its clean, sharp scent filling the circular room. A bed of sheepskins lay on a low platform. He laid her there, near the fire, but not so close as to scorch her. Her shivering was violent, a tremor that shook her whole body. The first task was warmth. He covered her with thick wool blankets, tucking them around her tightly. He filled a small pot with water and set it on a grate over the fire to heat. He moved with an economy of motion, his presence quiet and deliberate. He did not speak. Words were for later. Now, action was what was needed. He examined her hands. They were badly frostbitten, the skin tight and shiny. He knew he could not warm them too quickly. He took a handful of snow from just outside the door and began to gently, patiently, rub her hands with it. It was an old way to bring the life back without causing more damage. She cried out, a thin, weak sound, as sensation began to return. He kept his eyes on his task, granting her the dignity of her pain. When he was done, he wrapped her hands in strips of clean cotton cloth. Only then did he look at her face. Her eyes were open, wide with a fear that went deeper than the cold. They were the color of a summer sky, a startling blue in this world of gray and white. He met her gaze and gave a slow, small nod. He held up a hand, palm open, a sign of peace known across tribes and territories. He gestured to the fire, then to the blankets. He was offering shelter, nothing more. He could see the struggle in her eyes, the instinct to flee warring with an exhaustion so profound it was a physical weight. She closed her eyes, and a single tear tracked a path through the grime on her cheek. He retreated to the other side of the fire, giving her space. He sat on a small stool, his back straight, and watched the flames. He was a guardian, not a captor. It was important that she understood that. The law of his people was clear on this. A guest was to be protected. Their safety was his responsibility. But consent was the air beneath that law. Her will, her choice, had to be respected. He would not cross the fire unless invited. After a time, she stirred. Her canvas satchel, which had been slung over her shoulder, lay beside her on the sheepskins. Her eyes went to it, a flicker of renewed panic. Atsa remained still. He would not touch her things. She reached for it with her bandaged hands, wincing, and pulled it onto her lap, clutching it like a shield. He ladled some of the warm water into a clay cup and added dried mint leaves. He stood and walked slowly around the fire pit. He stopped a few feet from her, holding out the cup. He did not move closer. He waited. After a long moment, she reached out, her movement stiff, and took it from him. Their fingers did not touch. She sipped the hot liquid, her shivers slowly beginning to subside. He returned to his place. The silence in the hogan was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. It was a comfortable silence for him, but he knew it might not be for her. She finally spoke, her voice a dry rasp. She told him her name was Abigail Moore. She thanked him. Atsa nodded. He told her his name. He said that she was safe here. The words seemed to unlock something in her. Her story came out in broken pieces, halting phrases fueled by the returning warmth and the small act of kindness. She had been a passenger on the mail coach. It was attacked, not by Apaches, not by bandits looking for a payroll. It was targeted. They were after her. They took the driver and the guard, and they took her. She managed to escape during the night, running into the storm. She had been running for a day and a night. She paused, her gaze dropping to the canvas bag in her lap. She seemed to be debating. He waited, letting the silence stretch. It was her story to tell, or not. Finally, she opened the bag. With her clumsy, bandaged hands, she pulled out a leather-bound ledger. It was a simple thing, the kind a storekeeper might use. She held it out toward him. This was an invitation. He rose, crossed the small space, and took it. He sat and opened the book. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, but it was not a record of goods sold. It was a meticulous accounting of corruption, names, dates, amounts, payments made to land office clerks, to railroad foremen, to federal marshals, and one name appeared again and again, Silas Cade. Atsa knew the name. Cade was a railroad man, a rancher, a man who was buying up the territory one piece at a time, squeezing out small homesteaders and anyone who stood in his way. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a map. It was not a government map. It was hand-drawn, showing the location of hidden springs and underground aquifers, the secret lifeblood of this dry land. A thumbprint, made in dark ink, was pressed beside Cade's signature on an affidavit claiming sole water rights. The ledger was proof. It was the weapon that could stop a man like Cade. Abigail's voice was stronger now. She explained that she was a telegraph operator, but she was also a journalist, sending stories back east under a pen name. She had been gathering this information for months. piecing together how Cade was using bribes and fraudulent claims to steal the water right out from under people. The mail coach was supposed to take her to Mesquite Wells, where she planned to deliver the ledger to a circuit judge, the one man she believed Cade could not buy. Her pursuers were not just trying to get the book back, they were trying to silence her. Then she said the words that made the quiet Hogan feel suddenly small and exposed. She worked the telegraph. She knew how fast a message could travel. She said she was certain that by now, every telegraph office in the territory had received a message, a description, a warrant, a bounty, $100 for the woman, dead or alive. Atza closed the ledger. He could feel its weight in his hands, not just the physical weight of paper and leather, but the heavier weight of what it represented. He had wanted peace, and now a war had been brought to his door. His past rose up before him. He had seen what happened when you stood against men with power and paper on their side. He had seen his own people moved, starved, and killed, all under the banner of law. To help this woman was to step back into that world, to make himself a target. Every lawman, every bounty hunter, every desperate man looking for $100 would be looking for her. And now, they would be looking for him too. He looked at her. The fear was still in her eyes, but beneath it was a core of strength, a stubborn refusal to be broken. She had survived the ambush, the ropes, the freezing storm. She had not done it just to hand the proof over to the first person she saw. She was testing him, trusting him. He looked at the fire, the dancing heart of his home. It offered life. He had brought her to it, and in doing so, he had made a choice. He could not undo it now. He could not send her back out into the storm, either the one made of wind and snow or the one made of men and greed. To do so would be to lose the very part of himself he had come here to save. He placed the ledger on a small wooden table beside him. He met her gaze across the flames. He gave another slow nod, this one firmer than the first. It was not just an acknowledgement, it was a promise. He did not know where this path would lead. He only knew he had to walk it. For now, they would face the storm together. The storm did not break with the dawn. Instead, the sky lightened to a uniform, oppressive gray, and the snow continued its silent, relentless fall, softening the edges of the world. Atza fed the fire, the small flames a defiant spot of life against the cold. He had given Abigail a broth made from dried meat and herbs, and some of the color had returned to her face. She sat wrapped in blankets, the ledger safe beside her, her eyes following his every move. The fear had receded, replaced by a watchful intelligence. He spoke into the quiet. The Hogan is the first place they will look. It is a sign of life. We cannot stay. She looked around the small, warm space that had saved her. Where do we go? There is a place, a rock shelter, 2 valleys over. It is small, hidden from the wind, and the entrance is narrow. 1 man can defend it against many. He did not say that 1 man might have to. He did not need to. The journey was a slow agony for her. He wrapped her feet in spare pieces of sheepskin tied with leather thongs, as her shoes were useless. He took the lead, breaking a trail through the snow that was now knee-deep in the drifts. The landscape was a maze of canyons and mesas, and he moved through it with an intimacy born of years of watching and listening. He chose a path that stayed to the low ground, avoiding the ridges where they would be silhouetted against the sky. Every step was a calculation of risk and energy. For Abigail, every step was a fresh wave of pain from her battered body. But she did not complain. She held the canvas satchel containing the ledger tight to her chest and followed in the tracks he made. She watched the way he moved, his head constantly turning, his gaze sweeping across the snow, reading things she could not see. He was a part of this harsh land, while she was an intruder, a foreign element that had brought violence with her. The thought shamed her, but she pushed it down. Shame was a luxury she could not afford. Survival was the only currency that mattered here. The shelter was exactly as he had described it, a deep overhang in a rock face, almost a shallow cave, protected by a tumble of ancient boulders that formed a natural wall. The wind could not find its way in. Atsa gathered dry wood from the underside of fallen junipers, a trick of survival in a storm, and soon had a small, smokeless fire burning in the deepest part of the recess. The place was tight, barely large enough for 2 people and the fire. It felt both like a trap and a fortress. When the fire was steady, Atsa turned to her. He did not approach. He stood near the entrance. A sentinel. He said, "We will have rules here, small laws, so there is no misunderstanding." Abigail clutched her blankets tighter, her throat suddenly dry. She nodded for him to continue. "First," he said, his voice even and low, "we will keep a stone rolled against the entrance. It will not stop a determined man, but it will make noise. No one enters while you are alone unless you move the stone." He pointed to a large, flat rock that could be pivoted to block the narrowest part of the opening. "Second," his dark eyes met hers, and there was no threat in them, only a deep seriousness. "I will not touch you, not unless you ask for my help. Your body is your own. The boundary between us is your choice." Relief washed through her so powerfully it left her weak. The men who had tied her, who had handled her like a sack of grain, had taken that choice from her. This man, this stranger, who had every advantage of strength in isolation, was giving it back to her without condition. It was a gift more precious than warmth, more vital than food. She found her voice. "Thank you. The same rules apply to you. I will respect your space." A small, almost imperceptible nod was his only reply. He had established the foundation upon which trust could be built. He then took a piece of charcoal from the fire and, on the smooth rock wall of the shelter, he began to draw. It was a map. He showed her the hogan, the shelter, the town of Mesquite Wells, the direction of the railroad line. He drew the mountains and the canyons. "Here," he said, pointing to a spot on the map, "is the telegraph line. It follows the railway. It is a snake that runs across the land." Abigail knew that snake well. She had fed it messages, listened to its clicking voice. "I know," she said. "It carries the messages of Silas Cade. He uses it to pass threats from one station to the next. The station masters are afraid. They do his bidding. He bought Marshal Pike, the law in Mesquite Wells. Pike sends the official messages that give Cade cover. The bounty on my head was likely sent by Pike himself, making it legal." Atsa listened, his face impassive. He understood. The talking wire was a web, and a man like Cade was the spider at its center. The whole territory was caught in it. He told her, "I must go out. I need to see the tracks, to know who is hunting, and how close they are." The thought of being left alone, even behind the barricade stone, terrified her. But she saw the necessity in his eyes. She only nodded, pulling the blankets tighter. He left her with a small pile of wood, his rifle, and a water skin. He took only his bow and a long knife. A rifle shot was loud. It was a declaration. A bow was a whisper. He moved away from the shelter, a gray shape that dissolved into the falling snow. Time slowed for Abigail. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft hiss of the fire. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to take the shape of a man. She held the heavy rifle, unsure if she even had the strength to lift it properly. She was a woman of words and electricity, not of weapons and wilderness. Atsa, meanwhile, circled wide, using the terrain to hide his passage. He was not looking for his own old tracks, but for new ones. He found them within a mile of the shelter, in a place where the wind had swept the snow thin. Hoof prints. 4 horses, all shod. The Dine did not shoe their ponies. These were white men, and with the horse tracks, there were footprints. One set was distinctive. The heel was hard, square, and deep. It was the mark of a military-issue boot, a cavalryman, or a former one. Men like that were often hired for their skills. They knew how to track, how to fight, how to kill without hesitation. This was the work of a professional. This was the man she had to fear most. His name, he suspected, was Briggs, a name whispered among those who resisted Cade's expansion. A man who did Cade's dirty work. He erased the tracks he found, his own and theirs, using a pine branch to brush the snow over them, a small act that might buy them a little time. He saw no sign that they had found the shelter, or even the trail leading to it. For now, they were safe, but the hunters were close, too close. He returned as dusk began to bleed into the gray afternoon, a deeper shadow moving through the gloaming. He moved the stone at the entrance and slipped inside. The sight of him, solid and real, eased a knot of tension in her chest she had not realized she was holding. He told her what he had found, his voice calm, reporting facts without emotion. 4 riders. 1 wears army boots. They are circling, searching. They have not yet cut our trail. Night fell, a deep and utter blackness. The snow finally stopped, and the sky cleared, revealing a swath of cold, indifferent stars. With the clear sky came a deeper cold, one that sank into the rock and seemed to suck the heat from their small fire. Atsa took the first watch, sitting cross-legged at the entrance, his bow across his lap. The wolves began to howl. It started with a single, long cry, a sound of pure wildness and loneliness. Another answered, then another, until the night was filled with their chorus. They were not close, but they were not far. They were another layer of danger in this perilous landscape. Abigail felt a primal fear rise in her. Atsa put 2 fingers to his lips and let out a whistle. It was not human. It was a sharp, clear sound, like a hunting bird. He repeated it twice. The wolf calls faltered, then grew more distant. He had spoken to them in a language they understood, a warning from one hunter to another. This territory was his. Abigail eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep, exhaustion finally winning its battle with her fear. But her mind found no rest. It took her back to the mail coach, to the crash of glass and the splintering of wood, the rough hands grabbing her, the suffocating darkness of a blindfold, the burning friction of the ropes on her wrists. She was trapped, helpless, a piece of property to be claimed and disposed of. She cried out, a muffled sound of pure terror, and thrashed against the heavy blankets, fighting phantoms. Atsa was beside her in an instant. He did not touch her. He knelt on the other side of the fire, the flames between them, a barrier of light and heat. "Abigail," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Wake up, you are safe." Her eyes flew open. She was gasping for air, her heart hammering against her ribs. The rock shelter swam into focus. The fire, the silent man watching her. The dream clung to her like a shroud. She could still feel the ropes. He saw the panic in her eyes. He rose and fetched another blanket, a thick, heavy wool one. He held it out for a moment. Then, moving slowly so as not to startle her, he laid it over her, his hands coming nowhere near her body. It was an offering of comfort, of weight, of reality. "Breathe," he said. "The fear is a storm. You must anchor yourself. Breathe with the mountain. It is slow. It does not hurry." He took a slow, deep breath, demonstrating. In. He held it for a beat, then let it out in a long, controlled sigh. Out. She tried to follow, but her breaths were ragged. "Shallow things." Again, he urged, his voice a quiet rhythm. "In. Hold. Out. Match my breathing." She watched him across the flames. She focused on the slow rise and fall of his shoulders. She drew in a shaky breath, held it until her lungs burned, and let it go. He nodded. Again. They breathed together in the darkness, one desperate and frantic, the other calm and steady. Slowly, her rhythm began to match his. Her heartbeat began to slow. The lingering terror of the dream began to recede, pushed back by the simple, conscious act of drawing air into her lungs and letting it go. The storm inside her was passing. He did not speak again. He simply returned to his post at the entrance, a silent guardian against the dangers of the night, both real and remembered. Abigail lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of his steady breathing, a quiet anchor in the vast, dangerous darkness of the Arizona Territory. She understood that trust was not built on grand declarations. It was built on small things, a respected boundary, a shared blanket, a breath offered in the dark. The storm passed in the night, leaving behind a world scoured clean and silent. A brittle crust of ice formed over the deep snow, and the air was so cold and clear it felt sharp in the lungs. They moved at dawn, two small figures in a vast white landscape. Atsa knew they could not wait. The hunters would be on the move now, their search made easier by the clear weather. Mesquite Wells was their only hope, a gamble on the possibility that a few good people might outweigh a town full of fear. They did not approach the town from the main track. Atsa led Abigail on a winding path through a series of arroyos, their low walls hiding them from view. From a low rise, they saw it. Mesquite Wells was not a town of grand design. It was a place built of necessity, a collection of flat-roofed adobe buildings the color of the earth itself, huddled together against the immense emptiness of the plateau. The only things that spoke of the modern world were the twin lines of the railroad track gleaming in the morning sun, and the single, stark telegraph wire that ran alongside it, humming with invisible messages. It was a town of mud and electricity. Atsa pointed to a wisp of dark smoke rising from the edge of the settlement. That is the smithy, Eamon O'Rourke's place. He is a good man. His heart is as strong as his iron. We will start there. They entered the town like ghosts, slipping between buildings, avoiding the open spaces. The main street was already stirring with life. Men in heavy coats moved between the saloon and the general store. A wagon, its wheels creaking in the cold, rumbled past. No one looked their way. Atsa's presence, quiet and watchful, seemed to bend the light around them, making them invisible. The smithy was a cavern of heat and noise. The roar of the bellows and the rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel filled the air. Eamon O'Rourke was a mountain of a man. With arms thick as fence posts and a beard the color of rust, he was shaping a horseshoe, his movements economical and powerful. He looked up as they entered, his blue eyes taking in the sight of the dying warrior and the pale, exhausted woman in his charge. He did not stop his work. He finished shaping the shoe, plunged it hissing into a slack tub, and only then did he turn to face them, wiping his hands on a leather apron. "Atsa," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It has been a while. You bring trouble with you." Atsa nodded. "It found me. Eamon, this is Abigail Moore. She needs a safe place." Eamon's eyes rested on Abigail. He saw the torn dress, the raw wrists, the deep weariness in her face. He saw the way she clutched her satchel. He nodded slowly. "The fire is warm. Sit." He did not ask questions. In the West, a man did not ask about the trouble another man carried, unless he was prepared to take on a piece of it himself. Eamon's offer to sit by his fire was a declaration. He was taking a piece. Minutes later, a woman entered the smithy, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. She was not young, her face lined with the sun and sorrow of the territory, but her back was straight and her eyes were sharp and kind. This was Marta Valdez. She ran a small school for the town's children in the front room of her house. She was a widow, and she knew the weight of things. "Eamon," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I brought you some bread." She stopped when she saw Atsa and Abigail. Her gaze missed nothing. She looked from the raw marks on Abigail's wrists to the protective stance Atsa had taken near the door. Her expression softened. "Oh, you poor child," she said, moving toward Abigail. Atsa shifted slightly, a subtle movement, but Marta understood. She stopped a few feet away. "My name is Marta. You are safe here." Abigail, who had been tense as a drawn bowstring, felt some of the tightness in her chest release. She managed a weak smile. "Thank you." Before more could be said, another figure appeared in the wide doorway, casting a long shadow into the forge. It was a woman, younger than the others, wearing a deputy's badge pinned to her heavy coat. Deputy Nora Finch was new to the territory, her face still holding some of the softness of back east, but her eyes were serious, and her hand rested near the Colt revolver on her hip. "Marshal Pike sent me," she said, her voice a little too loud in the sudden silence of the smithy. The hammer was no longer ringing. He heard there was a dying man seen coming into town with a woman. Eamon stepped forward, placing his large body between the deputy and his guests. "She is just warming herself by the fire." "Deputy, the storm was hard on travelers." Nora's eyes flickered to Abigail, then back to Atsa. She had seen the posters that had come over the telegraph wire yesterday. $100. Wanted for questioning in the matter of the mail coach robbery. Signed by Marshal Jebediah Pike, a description that matched the woman huddled by the fire. Nora was the law, but she had also heard the whispers about Pike, about his cozy relationship with Silas Cade. She had seen the way small ranchers were being pushed off their land with legal papers that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Her conscience was a new and uncomfortable thing, not yet calloused over by the compromises of her profession. The decision was made for her when Marshal Pike himself appeared behind her. He was a thick man with a florid face and eyes that were small and hard. He pushed past Nora as if she were a piece of furniture. "Well, well," he said, his voice slick with false geniality. "Look what the storm blew in. That's Inez. I should have known you would be involved." He let his gaze slide over to Abigail. "And the little songbird from the telegraph office. I have a warrant for your arrest. Miss—" Abigail flinched, but Atsa stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a threatening move. He simply existed, a quiet and immovable obstacle. "She has committed no crime." Pike laughed. "A short, ugly sound. That is for the judge to decide. Now, I will take the woman and the ledger she is carrying. You give them to me, and I might forget I saw you. Nez, we can avoid any unpleasantness." The ledger. The word hung in the air, thick with meaning. So he knew. The message on the wire had not just been a wanted poster. It had been an inventory. Atsa's voice was as cold and flat as the plateau. No. The word was absolute. It was not a negotiation. It was a statement of fact. Pike's face hardened, the false friendliness vanishing. "You are obstructing justice. That is a crime." "It is only justice if it is just," Atsa replied. A low murmur came from the handful of men who had gathered in the doorway of the smithy, drawn by the confrontation. Pike was the law, but Atsa Nez had a reputation. He was a man who kept his word. Pike was not a fool. He knew that trying to take Atsa in the smithy, with Eamon O'Rourke standing there like an anvil, would be bloody. And he did not want blood. He wanted the ledger. He pointed a thick finger at Abigail. "I am giving you 1 hour. Bring her and the book to my office. If you do not, I will form a posse, and we will hunt you down. There is $100 on your head, dead or alive. Do not think for a second these good people will not be tempted." He turned and strode out, leaving Nora Finch in the awkward space between the two sides. She looked at Atsa, her expression a mixture of duty and doubt. Then, without a word, she followed her boss. The moment they were gone, Marta spoke. "The smithy is not safe. They will watch it now." Eamon nodded, his face grim. "Where can they go?" "The church," Marta said. "The old Adobe mission. Father Michael is away, visiting the southern parishes. It will be empty. They can hide in the rooms behind the sanctuary." Atsa looked at Abigail. It was her decision. She nodded, her resolve hardening. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was being overshadowed by a rising anger. They would not have her. They would not have the truth she carried. They slipped out the back of the smithy Eamon creating a diversion by starting a furious and loud hammering on a piece of sheet metal. Atsa led Abigail through a narrow alley to the back of the mission San Xavier. The old church stood as a silent testament to a different time. Its thick adobe walls seemed to absorb the sounds of the town, creating an aura of peace. They found a small, unlocked door that led into a sacristy. It was dark and cool inside, smelling of old wood and candle wax. From a small, high window, they could look out onto the main street. They watched as the town began to choose sides. They saw Marshal Pike come out of his office and nail a fresh poster to the wall. It was an official wanted notice, with Abigail's name and description, and the stark words, "Dead or alive." A group of men from the saloon gathered around it, their talk loud and speculative. $100 was more money than some of them saw in a year. Greed began to poison the air. But then they saw other things. Marta Valdez walked from the general store, her basket now full, and she stopped to speak to two other women. They spoke in low tones, their faces set with concern, and they all glanced toward the church. Eamon O'Rourke stood in the doorway of his smithy, his arms crossed, his hammer silent. He was watching the marshal's office. He was a sentinel. The town was a scale, and the weight of fear and money was being placed on one side. On the other side were the small, heavy stones of decency, friendship, and conscience. Atsa and Abigail, hidden in the heart of the church, could only watch and wait to see which way the balance would tip. The sun climbed higher, and the shadows on Main Street grew shorter. The hour Pike had given them was ticking away. The darkness in the old church was absolute, a heavy blanket that muffled the sounds from the town. Atsa and Abigail huddled in the small sacristy, the silence stretching between them. Atsa was not still. He was listening, not just with his ears, but with his whole body, feeling the vibrations through the packed earth floor. The hour Marshal Pike had given them had long since passed. The town was holding its breath. The attack came not with a shout, but with a whisper, the soft scrape of a boot on the adobe wall outside. Atsa was moving before the sound registered with Abigail, his hand gesturing for silence. He drew his long knife, its blade a sliver of darkness in the gloom. Another sound followed, the click of a rifle hammer being cocked. They were surrounded. A window at the far end of the sanctuary shattered, the noise echoing like a gunshot in the sacred space. Atsa did not move toward the sound. It was a feint. The real attack would come from the back, from the direction they had entered. He pulled Abigail toward a low, narrow door hidden behind the altar, a door that likely led to a storage cellar. "Get in," he breathed, his voice a puff of air against her ear. "Do not come out until I tell you." Before she could protest, he was gone, a shadow melting into other shadows. She slipped through the door and pulled it shut, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She heard a heavy thud as the sacristy door was kicked in, followed by the splintering of wood. There was a grunt, a short, sharp cry of pain, and then the sound of running feet. She waited in the suffocating darkness, clutching the satchel with the ledger, each second an eternity. The cellar door opened a crack. "It is time to go." Atsa's voice was calm, but strained. He had a dark bruise forming on his cheekbone. They moved through the now empty church and out the broken window. The night was moonless. Atsa pointed toward the dark maw of a canyon that cut into the plateau at the edge of town. "That is our only path." They ran, their feet stumbling on the uneven ground. Behind them, shouts rose from the town. A lantern flared to life. They had been seen. A shot rang out, the bullet whining past them in the darkness. They did not stop. They plunged into the canyon just as a strange warmth began to fill the air. The temperature was rising with an unnatural speed, the wind shifting from the north to the south. A warm rain began to fall, fat drops that hissed on the frozen ground. The snow, which had been their cover, was now their enemy. The warm rain was melting the deep drifts, and the water had nowhere to go but down. A trickle of water in the canyon floor became a stream, then a rushing torrent. The roar of it grew, a hungry sound that filled the narrow space. "We have to climb!" Atsa yelled over the growing noise. He found a series of handholds in the rock face and began to ascend, pulling Abigail up after him. They scrambled onto a narrow ledge. Just as a wall of brown, churning water filled the canyon from wall to wall, carrying with it rocks and uprooted trees. It was a flash flood, a sudden, violent artery of water coursing through the desert's stone heart. They were trapped on the ledge, the raging flood below them and a sheer rock face above. As the gray light of a miserable dawn broke, the rain eased, but the floodwaters continued to rage. It was in this dim light that Atsa saw it. On the opposite side of the canyon, on a small outcrop of rock that was rapidly shrinking as the water rose, was a child, a small dying girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old, her dark eyes wide with terror. She must have been caught in the storm, found shelter in the canyon, and was now marooned by the flood. Atsa did not hesitate. He unwound the rope he carried looped over his shoulder. "It is not long enough to cross. I have to get closer." He pointed to a large, half-submerged boulder downstream, closer to the girl's position. "If I can get to that rock, I can throw the rope to her." It was madness. The current was a liquid battering ram, but to do nothing was to watch the child perish. He looked at Abigail. "I need you to anchor the rope here. Wrap it around that horn of rock, and hold it. Do not let go, no matter what." Abigail nodded, her own fear for herself forgotten in the face of the small, terrified figure across the canyon. She did as he instructed, wrapping the rope around a solid protrusion of stone and then gripping the free end with both her bandaged hands. Atsa took a deep breath and launched himself into the torrent. The force of the water was immense, pulling him under immediately. Abigail's arms were nearly wrenched from their sockets as the rope went taut. She held on, her knuckles white, her teeth gritted. He surfaced, gasping, and fought his way toward the boulder. Using the rope as a lifeline, he made it, pulling his bruised body from the water onto the slick surface of the rock. He was now within throwing distance of the child. He coiled a section of the rope and threw it. It fell short. He pulled it in, his movement slow with exhaustion. He threw again. This time, it landed on the outcrop. He yelled instructions to the little girl in the Dine language, his voice carrying over the roar of the water. She was too frightened to move. He looked back at Abigail. "I have to go to her. You have to let out the rope slowly, but you cannot let go." Abigail understood. She would be his only connection to safety. He slipped back into the water, and she played out the line, the rough hemp scraping her raw hands. He fought his way across the remaining distance and pulled himself onto the rock beside the child. He spoke to her in low, calming tones, and finally, she allowed him to tie the rope around her small waist. He signaled to Abigail, "Pull, slowly." Abigail leaned back, putting all her weight into it. The rope slid through her hands, and the old wounds on her wrists, the places where the ropes had cut into her, broke open. A sharp, searing pain shot up her arms. Her grip faltered. She cried out as the rope began to slip, the friction burning her skin. In that moment, Atsa, fighting to keep his own footing in the current while holding the child, looked back and saw her failing. He was too far away to help. The child, the ledger, their lives. All of it depended on that single, failing connection. Suddenly, a second pair of hands closed over hers on the rope, strong, calloused hands. Eamon O'Rourke stood beside her, his face grim. Behind him was Deputy Nora Finch, her revolver drawn, her eyes scanning the canyon rim. "We saw them follow you out of town," the blacksmith grunted, adding his immense strength to hers. "We took the high trail." Together, they pulled. Atsa and the child were drawn through the churning water, back toward the safety of the ledge. They collapsed in a heap, soaked and shivering, but alive. Nora kept watch while Eamon helped Atsa check the little girl. She was unhurt, only terrified and cold. "We have to go," Nora said, her voice urgent. "Pike has a posse out. Briggs is leading them." Atsa nodded. He looked at the little girl. He could not take her with them. She would slow them down and put them all in greater danger. He took a small, carved bird from a pouch at his belt and tied it to a low-hanging branch of a hardy desert willow, in a place that was visible from the trail above. It was a dining trail marker. Marta Valdez would know what it meant. She would organize the women. They would find the child. "Amen," he said. "Take her to Marta's. Tell her what happened." The big blacksmith nodded. He gently lifted the child into his arms. "Be safe, Atsanez." Nora looked at Atsa, then at Abigail. "The law is a twisted thing in this town, but it is not broken everywhere. Get that book to the circuit judge." She pressed a small pouch into Abigail's hand. "Food, and a spare box of cartridges for the rifle. Go." They vanished back up the trail, leaving Atsa and Abigail alone once more. They climbed out of the canyon and moved deeper into the wilderness, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and Mesquite Wells. That night, they found shelter in a shallow cave, high up in the red rocks. The rain had stopped, and a cold wind was blowing again. Atsa built a small, careful fire. He took a moment to look at Abigail's hands. The bandages were soaked with blood. Without a word, he gently unwrapped them, cleaned the wounds with water from his canteen, and applied a poultice of crushed leaves he had gathered. As he worked, he was careful. His touch was light, clinical, but when he was done, he hesitated. Her hand lay in his. He looked at her, his dark eyes asking a question. "May I?" His voice was quiet. It was a question about more than just holding her hand. It was a question about everything that had happened between them. It was an affirmation of the rule they had made. Abigail looked at his strong, capable hand, the hand that had fought in the dark and pulled a child from a raging flood. She gave a small nod. He closed his hand gently around hers, his thumb stroking the back of it, a simple gesture of human connection that felt more profound than any embrace. They sat like that for a long time, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally, his gaze fixed on the flames. "This is not your fight." Abigail pulled her hand away, not in rejection, but to clutch the satchel with the ledger. "Yes, it is. My father was a farmer. In the next valley over, he had a good piece of land with a spring. Silas Cade wanted it. My father would not sell. So Cade produced a piece of paper, a legal document signed by a judge, saying he owned the water rights to the whole basin. The paper was a lie, but it had the stamp of the law on it. Our spring dried up. The farm died. My father died a year later. He was a man broken by a piece of paper. This ledger, this is my answer to that piece of paper." Her voice was thick with a grief that was still raw. Atsa listened, his expression unreadable. The firelight played across the strong lines of his face. He had always believed that the white man's world was built on paper. Paper promises, paper laws, paper money. All of it fragile and easily burned. But it was also a weapon, one that could kill a man as surely as a bullet. He understood her fight, and in that moment of shared understanding, he felt a need to offer his own truth, to balance the weight of her confession with his own. "I was a scout," he said, his voice low. "For the army? I thought I was helping to make peace. I showed them the trails, the water holes. I spoke the words of my people to their generals. They said they wanted to talk, but their words were just more paper. They led my people onto a reservation, a place where the earth was sick and the water was bitter. They called it a treaty. I called it a cage. I carry the shame of that. It is a wound that does not heal." He had never spoken of this to anyone. To admit it was to give voice to the deepest failure of his life. He had helped the enemy, and in doing so, had betrayed his own. Abigail looked at him, seeing for the first time the deep pain behind his quiet strength. She reached out and, this time, it was she who took his hand. "You were trying to save them," she said softly. "You were using the only tools you had." He did not reply. He simply held her hand. The two of them sitting together by a small fire in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. They were two different people from two different worlds, each wounded by the same kind of injustice. The flood had tried to wash them away, but it had failed. It had only succeeded in washing away the last of the distance between them. They left the canyon at first light, climbing toward the high country. The air grew thinner, cleaner, scented with pine and cold stone. Atsa led them away from the trails men used, following the paths of deer and mountain winds. He was taking her to Chul-i-i, the mountain the white men called Pine Mountain. It was a sacred place, a place of healing. He was taking her to his Nali Ada, his grandmother. The journey was a pilgrimage. With every upward step, the noise and fear of mesquite wells seemed to fade, replaced by the immense, breathing silence of the high peaks. Abigail felt the change not just in the air, but inside herself. The frantic rhythm of survival was slowing, giving way to a deeper, more enduring pulse. She watched Atsa move ahead of her, his steps sure and quiet on the pine needles. He was different here. The tension in his shoulders was gone. He belonged to this place, and for the first time since her ordeal began, she felt the possibility of a safety that was more than just a temporary hiding place. His grandmother's hogan was nestled in a grove of ancient ponderosa pines on a high slope of the mountain. It was older than Atsa's, the timbers silvered with age, the packed earth of its walls looking as if it had been raised by the land itself. An old woman with a face like a beautiful, intricate map of a long life sat by the eastward-facing door, weaving a small blanket. Her hands, though gnarled with age, moved with a fluid grace. She looked up as they approached, her dark eyes holding a wisdom that seemed as old as the mountain. She was Nali Ada. She showed no surprise. She simply nodded, a slow, welcoming gesture. She looked at Atsa, and in her gaze was a universe of love and understanding. Then she looked at Abigail, and her eyes softened. She saw the exhaustion, the pain, the lingering trauma. She rose without a word and gestured for them to enter the hogan. The air inside was warm and fragrant with the smell of herbs and burning cedar. It was a place of deep peace. Nali Ada took the satchel with the ledger from Abigail's shoulder and placed it carefully in a corner, as if she understood its weight but knew it had no power here. This was a place for healing the body and the spirit, not for fighting the battles of the world below. She had Abigail sit by the central fire and gently, patiently, unwrap the now dirty bandages from her hands. She examined the reopened wounds on her wrists and the raw, chapped skin. She clicked her tongue in a sound of sympathy. She then prepared a tea, boiling strips of willow bark in a small pot. The drink was bitter, but it eased the ache in Abigail's body in a way no medicine from a town doctor ever had. For her hands, Nali Ada made a poultice of crushed leaves and applied it, her touch firm but incredibly gentle. Over the next few days, a quiet routine settled over them. Nali Ada did not speak much English, but she communicated in a language of gestures, of shared tasks, of quiet presence. She taught Abigail not with words, but with actions. She would lead her to the edge of the forest and motion for her to sit, to simply be. At first, the silence was unnerving for Abigail, a woman used to the constant chatter of the telegraph. But slowly, she began to hear what Nali Ada intended. She heard the whisper of the wind in the high branches of the pines. She heard the chatter of a squirrel, the distant cry of a hawk. She learned to distinguish the silence of the forest from the absence of noise. One was empty, the other was full. Atsa's own healing was quieter, more internal. One evening, as Abigail watched, Nali Ada built up the fire and began to chant, her voice a low, melodic hum that seemed to vibrate with the very rhythm of the mountain. She handed Atsa a small bundle of sage. He lit it from the fire, the smoke spiraling upward, carrying a clean, sharp scent. He closed his eyes. Abigail knew she was witnessing something private, a ceremony of the soul. She watched as Atsa's face, illuminated by the firelight, became a landscape of memory. She saw the flicker of pain in his brow as he confronted the ghosts of his past, the faces of the soldiers he had guided and the dene he had inadvertently led into a cage. He did not fight the memories. He let them come, bathed in the sacred smoke and the sound of his grandmother's song. He was not erasing his past, but learning to carry it, not as a burden of shame, but as a scar that had become a part of him. When the song ended, and the smoke had cleared, a measure of peace had settled in his eyes. Their own connection grew in the spaces between the quiet moments. One morning, Nalieda had them grind corn, using a large, smooth stone, the metate, and a smaller handstone, the mano. They knelt on opposite sides of the stone, their movements finding a shared rhythm. The work was hard, repetitive, grounding their hands, dusty with the yellow cornmeal, brushed against each other. It was an accident, a small, fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt of warmth through Abigail. She looked up and met Atsa's gaze. In his eyes, she saw not the guarded warrior or the stoic guide, but the man himself, his own vulnerability reflected in the firelight. The moment passed, but it left something changed between them. The air was charged with a new awareness. That evening, the three of them sat by the fire, the day's work done. Nalieda was spinning wool, her spindle a blur of motion. The hogan was a circle of warmth and safety against the vast, cold darkness of the mountain. After a while, the old woman rose, gave them both a knowing, gentle look, and retreated to a small alcove to sleep, leaving them alone by the fire. Abigail felt a deep sense of contentment, of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She was tired, a good, honest weariness from a day of useful work. She leaned her head against Atsa's shoulder. It felt natural, right. He did not stiffen. He remained still, a solid, warm presence beside her. They sat like that for a long time, watching the flames dance, listening to the silence of the hogan. He turned his head slightly, his cheek brushing against her hair. His voice was so low it was almost part of the fire's crackle. Is this all right? The simple question held the weight of all his respect for her, all his understanding of what she had endured. He was not assuming, he was not taking, he was asking, he was giving her the choice that had been stolen from her. Abigail lifted her head and looked at him. She did not need words. She simply nodded, a clear and certain gesture. He leaned in, his movement slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to turn away. He did not. His lips met hers. The kiss was not one of passion or of demand. It was gentle, soft, as tentative and pure as the first snowfall of winter on the high peaks. It was a promise of tenderness, of a safety that went deeper than just physical protection. It was the sealing of a bond that had been forged in a storm and tempered by a flood. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. They breathed the same air, their hearts beating in a slow, steady rhythm. "We should make a promise," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You and I." "What promise?" she whispered. "No lies, not ever. Between us, there will only be the truth." Abigail thought of her father, broken by a legal lie. She thought of the ledger in the corner, her weapon of truth. Yes, she said, no lies. And he continued, his voice hardening slightly with conviction. "We will not use violence. If there is another way, I have seen enough killing. We will use our minds, our courage. We will fight with the truth, not just with guns." His words resonated with a deep chord inside her. It was the creed she had been living by without ever having given it a name. It was the reason she had chosen to use a ledger instead of a weapon. "We will find another way," she agreed. They sealed their promise not with another kiss, but with a simple joining of hands in the warm firelight. It was a quiet vow, made in the heart of a sacred mountain, witnessed only by the ancient spirits of the place. They were no longer just a protector and a victim. They were partners. They had found in each other a sanctuary, as real and as strong as the old hogan that sheltered them from the world. The peace of the high mountain was shattered by the sound of a horse being ridden hard. It was Eamon O'Rourke, his face grim, his big horse lathered in sweat. He did not dismount but leaned from the saddle, his voice a low, urgent rumble that cut through the crisp air. Nali Ada stood from her weaving, her face impassive but her eyes suddenly sharp. Atsa met him at the edge of the clearing. "What is it?" "A message," the blacksmith panted, handing Atsa a small, folded piece of paper. "From the deputy." Atsa unfolded it. The handwriting was neat and clear. "Cade comes on the noon train, 2 days from now. He brings surveyors and federal papers to seize the water. Pike has taken Marta. He holds her in the jail. He sent word to me the woman and the ledger, in exchange for the teacher's life." The words fell like stones into the quiet sanctuary they had built. Marta, kind, strong Marta, who had offered them bread and safety, was now a pawn in Pike's dirty game. Abigail felt a cold fury rise within her, a feeling so intense it burned away the last vestiges of her fear. They had taken the fight to an innocent woman. They had crossed a line. Nali Ada, who had understood the meaning if not the words, placed a hand on Atsa's arm. Her touch was light, but it carried the weight of the mountain. She looked at Abigail, and in her eyes was not pity, but a profound and sorrowful respect. She knew their time of healing was over. There was no discussion, no debate. The decision was made in the silent exchange of looks between Atsa and Abigail. They would go back. They would not trade the ledger for a life. They would save the life and use the ledger to win the war. They gathered their few things. As they prepared to leave, Nali Ada pressed a small, hard bundle of dried herbs and meat into Abigail's hands. "For the journey," she said, one of the few English phrases she used. Then she looked at Atsa. "Hozo Nasha," walk in beauty. It was not a farewell. It was a blessing, a prayer for harmony in the midst of the chaos they were about to enter. They descended the mountain under the cover of a sky thick with clouds, a promise of a moonless night to come. They did not speak. Their purpose was a silent, driving engine between them. They skirted Mesquite Wells and went straight to the smithy, slipping through the back entrance into the familiar heat and smell of coal and iron. Eamon was there, and a few minutes later, Deputy Nora Finch arrived, looking pale but resolute. The four of them gathered in the back of the forge, the hiss of the bellows providing a curtain of sound for their low voices. Nora laid out the situation. "Pike is holding Marta in the main cell. He has 2 of his men guarding the office at all times. Briggs and his riders are camped just outside of town, waiting. They are watching the roads. Cade's train arrives tomorrow. He plans to have the papers signed and the water rights seized before the circuit judge even gets here. He wants it all to be legal on paper." "It is a cage," Atsa said, his voice flat. "He makes a cage of paper and law and puts Marta in the middle of it." "We cannot fight our way in," Eamon rumbled, his big hands clenching into fists. "They would see us coming a mile away." "Then we do not fight," Abigail said, her voice clear and steady. All eyes turned to her. She was no longer the frightened survivor Atsa had carried from the snow. Her time on the mountain had forged something new in her. "We use our heads. We turn their own weapons against them." "What do you mean?" Nora asked. "Cade's power comes from 2 things, Abigail explained, her mind working with the speed and precision of a telegraph key, his paper, and his control of information. We need to disrupt both. Marshal Pike is an arrogant man. He is also lazy. With Cade coming, he will be overwhelmed with paperwork, with taking statements, with looking important. He will need help." Nora saw it first. "He has been complaining about needing a clerk." "Exactly," Abigail said. "You will go to him, deputy. You will tell him you found someone, a traveler, stranded in town, who knows shorthand and can help him get his records in order before the railroad men arrive. Someone quiet and efficient." "You," Eamon said, his brow furrowed with concern. It is too dangerous. If they recognize you. They will not, Abigail insisted. A different dress, my hair pinned up, a pair of reading glasses from the general store. I will be invisible. I have spent my life being invisible in telegraph offices. Men like Pike do not truly see women like me. They see a pair of hands to do a job. Atza watched her, his expression unreadable. He saw the risk, but he also saw the cold, sharp intelligence in her plan. It was a move born of courage, not desperation. It was a way to fight without firing a shot, a direct fulfillment of the promise they had made to each other. "It is a good plan," he said simply, his support silencing any further argument. "While you are inside, you will be our eyes and ears. You will learn the layout, the number of guards, the routine." "But what is the point?" Eamon asked. "Getting you inside does not get Marta out." Atza turned to the blacksmith. "That is where you come in. My friend, we need a diversion. A big one. Something that will pull Pike and most of his men out of that office and keep them occupied." Eamon's face split into a rare grin. "A diversion. I think I can manage that. A disagreement in the saloon, perhaps. One that spills out into the street. It might get a little loud." "While they are distracted," Atza continued, "I will go for Marta. I will use the night. I will be a ghost." Nora nodded, adding her piece to the puzzle. "Pike keeps a spare key to the cells on a hook inside his private office. If you can get inside. Abigail, you might be able to get it to Atza through the back window." "There is one more thing," Atza said, his voice lowering. "Cade's papers. His power rests in the land surveys. The maps that define the water rights, he will have them with him, or he will have sent them ahead." "They are in the railroad office," Nora confirmed. "Locked in the safe. Cade is bringing a special surveyor's transit on the train, a new, precise instrument, to make the final measurements look official. The plans are to sign the papers in Pike's office, using the maps from the safe and the new measurements as proof." "Then we must discredit the proof," Atza said. He looked at Eamon. "I need you to make me something. A surveyor's measuring chain. But it must be wrong. Each link must be a fraction of an inch too short." Eamon's eyes lit up with understanding. Over a distance of 100 feet, the error would be small, but over a mile, it would be enormous. It would make any map drawn from it a complete fiction. It would make Cade's claims a laughingstock. "We will swap the chains," Abigail said, the final piece of the plan clicking into place. "While I am inside, I will find a way to get the real chain from the railroad office and replace it with Eamon's. When Cade's man makes his measurements, he will be using a lie to create a lie." The plan was audacious, dangerous, and intricate. It relied on perfect timing, on courage, and on the arrogance of their enemies. It was a heist, not for money, but for justice. The rest of the day was a blur of quiet, intense preparation. Eamon worked at his forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer a defiant heartbeat in the tense town. But he was not making horseshoes. He was forging a chain of false measures. Nora made discreet inquiries, confirming Pike's routines, learning the name of the night guard. Atza disappeared, melting into the landscape to scout the alleys and rooftops around the marshal's office, memorizing every shadow, every escape route. Abigail, with Marta's help through a network of sympathetic women, transformed herself. She traded her torn dress for a severe, high-collared gray one. She found a pair of plain spectacles in the mercantile that magnified her eyes slightly, giving her a studious, owlish look. She pulled her corn silk hair back into a tight, unforgiving bun. When she looked at her reflection in a piece of polished tin, she barely recognized herself. She was no longer Abigail Moore, the hunted woman. She was Miss Annabelle Smith, a prim and proper clerk, the last person anyone would suspect of dismantling a conspiracy. As dusk fell, Nora went to the marshal's office. The others, hidden in the smithy, waited. The minutes stretched into an hour. Finally, the deputy returned, her face pale but her eyes shining with a small victory. He hired her. Nora said, he barely looked at her. He just grumbled about the paperwork and told her to start in the morning. No, Abigail said firmly. I will start tonight. I will tell him I am eager to get things in order before the railroad men arrive. I will offer to work late. I need to be in that office when Eamon starts his party. Her resolve was absolute. This was her move to make. Atsa walked with her to the edge of the smithy's deep shadows, the two of them alone for a moment in the gathering dark. He did not wish her luck. Luck was not part of their plan. Instead, he reached out and gently adjusted the spectacles on her nose. Be careful, he said. You too, she whispered back. Then she stepped out of the shadows and walked down the street toward the pool of light spilling from the marshal's office. She walked with a straight back and a steady gait. A woman armed with nothing more than her own intelligence and a promise made on a sacred mountain. The first move in their quiet, desperate war had begun. The whistle of the noon train was a long, mournful cry that echoed from the distant mesas and settled over mesquite wells like a shroud. It was the sound of progress, of the world shrinking. But today it was the sound of a closing trap. Silas Cade was on that train, and with him, he brought the full, crushing weight of a corrupted law. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind of silent, desperate action. The plan forged in the smithy had worked, a testament to its careful construction. Eamon's diversion, a spectacular and deafening brawl that he single-handedly started and finished in front of the saloon, had drawn Marshal Pike and his deputies out of their office like bees from a smoked hive. In that window of chaos, Atsa had moved through the shadows, a ghost in the alleyways. Abigail, already inside the office. Her presence as the prim clerk unquestioned had slipped the spare key through the bars of the back window. Atsa had freed Marta, and the two of them had vanished into the night, the schoolteacher now safely hidden in the cellar of a sympathetic rancher miles from town. Abigail had even managed to swap Eamon's subtly flawed surveyor's chain for the real one in the railroad office. They had won the first battle, but the arrival of the train signaled the beginning of the war. They gathered again in the relative safety of the smithy's rear storeroom, the air thick with the smell of coal dust and tension. Nora Finch, her face pale, brought the latest news. It is worse than we thought, she said, her voice a low, hurried whisper. Cade is not just bringing papers. He is bringing the circuit judge with him. On the same train, he means to have the judge witness the signing and filing of the water claims the moment he steps onto the platform. He wants to make it an unimpeachable public event. But there is more, she continued, looking from Atsa to Abigail. I overheard Pike talking to one of Cade's men. There is an old records warehouse down by the tracks. It holds all the original county land grants, some dating back to the Spanish deeds. Tonight, after Cade has his new papers filed, the warehouse is going to have an accident, a fire. It will destroy any old claims that might contradict his. Abigail felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. It was a scorched earth campaign. He was not just stealing the future. He was burning the past. All of our work with the chain, the ledger, it will not matter if the original maps are gone. Atsa's eyes narrowed. He looked at Nora. The original maps, where are they? That is the problem, the deputy said. Cade is too smart to leave them in the warehouse to burn. His man said Cade had them brought from the territorial capital. They are with him now, on the train, in a locked records car, guarded. The train, Eamon rumbled. It sits on the tracks like a steel fortress. A fortress we must enter, Atsa said, his voice quiet but absolute. The promise he had made to Abigail, to fight with their minds, was being tested. But the promise had a second part to find another way, not to surrender. The maps are the heart of his power. We must take them, and we must replace them with something that will expose him. Abigail's mind, trained by the logic of coded messages, saw the pattern. I have the ledger. I have seen the forgeries. I can create a new map, one that shows the water rights as Cade claims them, but with a flaw. A detail that I can prove in court is impossible. Something that shows it was drawn by someone with no real knowledge of the land. It will be his own lie, turned into a trap. She spent the next hour working at a small, cluttered desk in the back of the smithy, a single lamp throwing her shadow large against the wall. She worked with a focused intensity, her pen scratching across a piece of parchment. She was no longer just a victim or a witness. She was an artisan of truth, crafting a weapon more precise than any gun. As she worked, Atsa, Eamon, and Nora laid their plan. The records car was attached to the rear of the train. It was a sturdy wooden box on wheels, with a single guard posted at its door. The bustle of the judge's arrival would provide their only cover. When the time came, they moved. The platform was crowded. The mayor, Marshal Pike, and a committee of somber-faced townsmen stood waiting to greet the judge. Eamon, looking like any other curious citizen, ambled toward the rear of the train, his sheer bulk creating a small eddy in the flow of the crowd. Nora, in her official capacity, moved along the platform, speaking to people, subtly keeping them away from the records car. Atsa and Abigail slipped between two buildings, emerging on the far side of the tracks, the side away from the platform. The guard on the records car was doing a poor job of hiding his interest in the reception unfolding on the other side. His attention was fixed on the judge, a stout, important-looking man now descending the steps of his private car. Now, Atsa breathed. He moved with a liquid speed, silent as a flowing shadow. He crossed the tracks, climbed the couplings between the last two cars, and dropped onto the small platform outside the records car door. The guard never saw him. A single precise strike to the base of the man's neck, delivered with the heel of his hand, and the guard slumped to the floor, unconscious but unharmed. Atsa dragged him inside and closed the door. A moment later, he opened it a crack and signaled. Abigail ran across the tracks, her heart pounding, the false map clutched in her hand. Eamon, seeing the signal, created his second diversion of the day. He stumbled, letting out a great roar of frustration, and sent a stack of wooden crates crashing to the platform. The noise drew a fresh wave of attention, pulling every eye, including Pike's, away from the rear of the train for a precious few seconds. It was all the time they needed. Abigail slipped inside the records car. It was filled with wooden filing cabinets and document chests. A large, iron-bound chest stood in the center of the car. "Cades," Atsa said, pointing to the elaborate SC monogram on its lid. The lock was thick and new. Eamon's part was not over. He had given Atsa a small, powerful steel pry bar of his own making. Atsa wedged it into the seam of the chest and put his weight against it. The wood groaned, splintered, and the hasp tore free with a sharp crack. Inside, nestled amongst other legal documents, was a heavy oilskin tube. Abigail opened it. Inside were the original territorial maps, the true history of the land and its water, drawn on aging linen. Quickly, she made the switch, placing her own carefully crafted forgery into the tube and handing the real maps to Atsa, who tucked them securely inside his shirt. They had done it. Then, with a great hiss of steam and a sudden, violent jolt, the train began to move. They had been discovered. The guard, recovering faster than expected, must have been found. A shout went up from the platform. They were trapped. "The roof," Atsa said, pointing to a service ladder at the end of the car. He went first, pushing open the hatch and scrambling out into the wind and the smoke. The train was picking up speed, the town of Mesquite Wells already beginning to recede behind them. Abigail followed, her skirts whipping in the wind, the noise of the steel wheels on the track a deafening roar. They were not alone. A figure was running toward them from the front of the train, leaping from the roof of one car to the next with a practiced, deadly grace. It was Briggs, his face a mask of cold fury, a revolver in his hand. He fired, the shot going wide as the train swayed. Atsa pushed Abigail behind him, shielding her with his body. He drew his own revolver, but he did not fire. He saw the faces of passengers looking out the windows of the cars ahead. He saw the open countryside, where a stray bullet could hit anyone. He remembered his promise another way. The train was approaching the high railway bridge that spanned the dry, rocky bed of the Mesquite River. Atza holstered his weapon and drew his knife. Briggs fired again, the bullet tugging at Atza's sleeve. Atza closed the distance, not running, but moving with a balanced, predatory gait. They met in the middle of a passenger car, the wind trying to tear them from their footing. Briggs lunged, and Atza turned the man's momentum against him, sending him sprawling. Briggs rolled and came up, his gun flying from his hand and skittering across the roof. He drew a knife of his own, a long, ugly blade. The fight was a brutal ballet on a narrow, moving stage. They were silhouetted against the sky as the train rumbled onto the bridge. The world fell away below them, nothing but open air and the distant, stony ground. Atza was quicker, his movements more fluid. He fought not with rage, but with a cold, focused precision. He was not trying to kill Briggs. He was trying to survive. He saw his opening. As Briggs lunged again, Atza dropped low, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. Briggs fell backward, and in that same motion, Atza hooked his arm, pulling him over the edge of the car. For a heart-stopping second, they were both airborne, two figures falling from the sky. They hit the steep, gravelly embankment of the riverbed below, rolling and tumbling in an avalanche of loose rock. Atza, who had controlled their fall as much as possible, came to a stop on his feet, bruised and battered but upright. Briggs lay in a heap, the wind knocked out of him, his knife yards away. Atza stood over him, his chest heaving. He could have finished it. He could have ended the threat of Briggs forever, but he looked at the man, defeated and gasping on the ground, and he saw not a monster, but just a man on the wrong side of a fight. He picked up Briggs' gun and his knife and threw them far into the scrub brush. He left him there, alive and disarmed, a problem for another day. He had kept his promise. He looked up. The train was gone, a plume of smoke in the distance, but tucked inside his shirt, safe against his skin, were the maps. He had the truth. The high, thin air of Mesquite Wells tasted of coal smoke and fear. The train had not left. It sat on the tracks, a silent iron beast, its journey interrupted. Abigail had made her way from the stopped cars, melting into the alleys just as Atza, bruised and dust-covered, returned from the riverbed with the real maps tucked safely inside his shirt. They met Nora and Eamon in the shadows behind the smithy, their reunion a brief, grim exchange of nods. They had all the pieces. Now they had to play the game. Main Street was the board. It was not yet high noon, but the sun was bright and unforgiving, bleaching the color from the adobe buildings and making the street a stage. At the center of that stage stood Circuit Judge Alistair Blackwood. He was a man accustomed to the order of a courtroom, and he did not appreciate having his authority challenged in the middle of a dusty street. Silas Cade stood near him, his face a mask of controlled fury. Marshal Pike was beside him, sweating in the cold air, his hand hovering near his gun. The townspeople formed the audience. They stood in the doorways of the mercantile and the saloon, on the boardwalks and in the street itself, a silent, watchful jury. They had seen the chase, heard the gunshots. They knew something fundamental was happening to their town. The arrival of Atza, Abigail, Eamon, and Nora was the signal for the play to begin. They walked out from between the buildings, not as fugitives, but as participants. They stopped 20 feet from the official party. Judge Blackwood's voice was a gavel in the silence. Marshal Pike. What is the meaning of this? I was told we were stopping to file some simple land claims. I find myself in the middle of a gunfight on a bridge. Explain yourself. Before Pike could stammer a reply, Silas Cade stepped forward, his voice smooth and commanding. Your Honor, a simple misunderstanding. This woman, Abigail Moore, is a fugitive. She robbed the mail coach and stole sensitive documents from my company. This man, Atza Nez, is her accomplice. They are criminals, and they resisted a lawful arrest. He held up the oilskin tube they had taken from the train. I have the documents right here. The official water rights surveys for the entire basin, ready for your signature and seal. The judge looked from Cade's confident face to the small group opposing him. He was a man of the law, and he followed procedure. He addressed Abigail. "Young woman, you have been accused of a serious crime. What do you have to say for yourself?" Abigail stepped forward. The spectacles were gone. Her hair was unbound. She was no longer a clerk. She was an accuser. She held the worn leather ledger in her hands. "Your Honor, my name is Abigail Moore. I did not rob anyone. I am a telegrapher and a journalist. What I have here is not stolen. It is evidence. It is a record of the crimes Silas Cade has committed against the people of this territory." Cade laughed, a dismissive, ugly sound. "A child's diary, a book of lies." Abigail's voice did not waver. She opened the ledger. On October the 12th, a payment of $50 was made to the land office clerk in Prescott for the misfiling of the Henderson property deed. On October the 23rd, a payment of $100 was made to Marshal Jebediah Pike for the issuance of a false warrant. On November the 2nd, a payment of $200 was made to Marshal Pike for services rendered in the matter of the Miller Creek water dispute. A gasp went through the crowd. Pike's face went from red to a pasty white. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. "Lies," Cade snarled. "Slander from a desperate woman. Where is your proof?" Abigail looked at the judge. "The proof, Your Honor, is in the details. The ledger contains information only the guilty parties would know, and it contains the truth about the water." Cade held up the tube again. "This is the truth. A federally certified survey." Deputy Nora Finch stepped forward then, her face set and serious. "No, Your Honor, that is the lie." She unrolled the authentic maps that Atsa had carried from the riverbed. "This is the truth." She held them up. They were old. The lines faded. The linen softened with age, but they clearly showed the springs, the homesteads, the old Spanish grants, the water rights that belonged to the people, dine and settler alike. These are the official county records. I submit them as evidence. The judge took the old maps, his eyes scanning them with a practiced gaze. He looked at the new, crisp map Cade had unrolled on a nearby barrel. He was a man of paper, and he could read the story it told. Cade saw his advantage slipping away. The legal battle was lost. He turned to the other kind of battle. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to his men who were scattered through the crowd, and he looked at the figure who had just limped into the street, his clothes torn and dusty, his face a mask of hate. It was Briggs. He had found a gun. "Shoot them!" Cade ordered, his voice cracking the tense silence. "Shoot them all!" The world exploded into motion. Briggs raised his revolver and fired at Atsa. The shot was fast, but Atsa was faster. He moved, the bullet searing a hot line across his shoulder, staggering him but not felling him. Atsa drew his own gun, not aiming for the man's chest, but for the gun in his hand. It was the fight on the roof again, but this time at a deadly distance. Marshal Pike, his panic turning to action, drew his own weapon, aiming it at Abigail. But before he could fire, a single, sharp crack echoed from beside him. Nora Finch stood, her own revolver smoking, her aim true. Pike's gun flew from his hand, clattering onto the dusty street. She had disarmed her boss, the ultimate act of defiance, the final cleansing of her office. Cade's other men, hired guns and opportunistic saloon dwellers, began to draw their weapons. But something had shifted in the crowd. The town was no longer a passive audience. As one, Eamon O'Rourke stepped forward. His massive frame a wall of solid muscle, he stood in front of Abigail. And then another man joined him, a storekeeper, and then two ranchers, and then Marta Valdez and the women she had organized. They did not have guns. They had their bodies. They formed a living, breathing shield around Abigail and the ledger. a human wall of decency against Cade's greed. They had chosen their side. The standoff lasted only a second. The hired guns looked at the determined faces of their neighbors and their nerve broke. This was not a fight they were being paid enough to win. Atsa and Briggs fired at the same time. Atsa's bullet struck the barrel of Briggs's gun, sending it spinning away. Briggs's shot went wild. Atsa stood, his shoulder burning, his gun steady on the disarmed gunman. He did not fire again. It was over. Judge Blackwood's voice cut through the smell of gunpowder. Enough. He had seen everything. He walked over to the barrel where Cade's map lay. He ignored the lines and the claims. He looked at one thing only, the official-looking wax seal at the bottom. He ran his thumb over it. Then he took a small penknife from his pocket and scraped at the edge. The wax flaked away, revealing the cheap, brittle material beneath. It was not the federal seal. It was a forgery, a clumsy one, but one meant to look real from a distance. It was the final piece of evidence, a small, physical lie that unraveled the entire conspiracy. The judge looked at Silas Cade, and for the first time, all the power was on the judge's side. "Silas Cade," he said, his voice ringing with the cold, hard authority of the law. "I am placing you under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, bribery, and attempted murder. Deputy Finch, take this man into custody." Nora, her gun still steady, moved to do just that. Cade stared, his face a picture of disbelief. He had built an empire of paper and fear, and it had all crumbled to dust in a single moment on Main Street. The broken seal was a symbol of his own broken power. He had believed he was above the law. He had discovered, too late, that the law, when wielded by courageous people, was still the sharpest weapon of all. The smoke from the guns cleared slowly, reluctantly, as if unwilling to release its hold on Main Street. In its place, a fragile quiet descended. The confrontation was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. Nora Finch, her face grim but her hands steady, snapped a pair of iron handcuffs onto the wrists of Silas Cade. The metallic click was the final, definitive sound of his fallen empire. Jebediah Pike stood nearby, his face ashen, while another lawman cuffed him, the corrupt marshal, who had once been the symbol of the law in Mesquite Wells, was now its prisoner. The townsfolk, who had formed a human shield, did not cheer. There was no triumphant roar. Instead, there was a collective sigh, a release of breath that had been held for months, for years. They looked at each other, not as members of a mob, but as neighbors who had, in a single, unified moment, reclaimed their town. Eamon O'Rourke put a heavy, comforting hand on Abigail's shoulder. Marta Valdez, her eyes shining with unshed tears, simply nodded at her. The gesture was one of profound gratitude. Judge Blackwood, a man revitalized by the sudden and dramatic application of true justice, took charge. He convened an impromptu hearing right there in the street, using the porch of the Mercantile as his bench. Silas Cade, his expensive suit now covered in dust, stood before him. His arrogance finally cracked, revealing the hollow man beneath. It was then that Briggs, the hired gun, made his choice. He was surrounded, disarmed, and defeated. He had served a man who had not hesitated to sacrifice him. He saw the cold reality of his future, a prison cell or a hangman's noose. But he also saw another path. He looked at Atsa, the man who had beaten him twice and spared his life both times. He had been shown a different kind of strength, one that was not measured in brutality. "I will testify," Briggs said, his voice rough. "I will tell you everything, in exchange for leniency." Judge Blackwood considered him for a long moment. "Speak." Briggs spoke, and the last of Cade's secrets were laid bare. He told them of the intimidation, the threats, the men who had been run off their land, and then he revealed the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. It was not just the public telegraph that Cade had used. Cade had his own private wire, a secret line that ran from his office on the train directly to key men in his organization. including Pike. It was a network of whispers, a shadow nervous system for his corrupt enterprise, allowing him to give orders that were never seen by any official operator. This was how he had coordinated the attack on the mail coach, how he had orchestrated the web of lies so perfectly. It was the smoking gun, the irrefutable proof of a criminal conspiracy. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive, with Abigail's ledger, the authentic maps, and now Briggs's testimony. The case against Cade and Pike was ironclad. Judge Blackwood, sitting in a makeshift courtroom in the town's small meeting hall, issued a series of rulings that sent shockwaves through the territory. He nullified every land and water claim signed by Silas Cade. He declared the forged documents to be a federal crime. He sent a telegraph message of his own, a long and detailed one, to the territorial governor, outlining the depth of the corruption. The effect was immediate. The paper dam that Cade had built was broken. The water, the lifeblood of the high desert, was freed. A notice was posted, written in the judge's own hand, restoring all T water rights to the ranchers, the homesteaders, and the dying. According to the original, historic maps, the stream of justice, which had been dammed and diverted, was flowing freely once more. In the days that followed, Mesquite Wells began to heal. The change was palpable. The fear that had been a constant, low hum in the background of daily life was gone. In its place was a sense of ownership, of shared purpose. The town was not perfect, but it was theirs again. The most visible sign of this change was the election of a new town marshal. The choice was unanimous. Nora Finch, the deputy who had chosen her conscience over her career, was given the badge. She accepted it with a quiet humility that stood in stark contrast to Pike's blustering authority. She represented a new kind of law for Mesquite Wells, one that served the community, not the powerful. Marta Valdez, freed and vindicated, reopened her school, but she did more than that. She started an evening class for the adults, teaching reading and writing to ranchers and laborers who had never had the chance to learn. The classroom, once a place of quiet instruction for children, became a vibrant hub of community life, a place where people were forging the tools they needed to protect themselves from the kind of paper-based deception Cade had used. Atsa's wound was a clean shot that had passed through the flesh of his shoulder without hitting bone. Marta, who knew as much about healing as any town doctor, cleaned and stitched it. The physical pain was nothing compared to the slow mending of his spirit. He had re-entered the white man's world of conflict and law, but he had done so on his own terms. He had fought, but he had not killed. He had honored his promise to Abigail and to himself. When he walked down Main Street now, the townsfolk did not look away or stare with suspicion. They met his gaze and nodded, a gesture of respect that was worth more than any medal the army could have given him. He had found a place, not just in the wilderness, but among people. The news of the trial, and of Abigail's role in it, traveled fast along the very telegraph wires she had once operated. Her meticulous ledger, her brave testimony, and her skillful creation of the forged map that had trapped Cade became the talk of the territory. A message arrived for her from the editor of the Topeka Capital Journal, the largest newspaper in the region. They had been publishing her anonymous articles for months. Now, they offered her a full-time position as an investigative reporter, with her own byline. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. A career, a voice, a platform to continue her fight for justice on a much larger stage. The offer was a crossroads. Topeka was a world away from the dusty streets of Mesquite Wells. It was a world of printing presses, of politics, of a future she had fought for. But Mesquite Wells held something else. It held the memory of a shared fire in a storm, of a promise made on a sacred mountain. It held the quiet strength of Amon, the fierce integrity of Nora, the enduring wisdom of Marta. And it held Atsa. She found him one evening by the creek at the edge of town. The water was running clear and full, no longer choked by Cade's illegal dams. The setting sun painted the high clouds in shades of orange and rose. He was watching the water, his arm in a sling, his expression thoughtful. He knew about the offer from Topeka. News, like water, now flowed freely in mesquite wells. He turned to her as she approached, his dark eyes searching her face. "It is a great honor," he said. "You have earned it." Abigail stood beside him, watching the creek flow past. "I know. It is what I have always wanted, to have a voice that people will listen to." "And you will," he said. "Your voice is strong. It will be heard far from here." There was no sadness in his tone, only a quiet statement of fact. He was not asking her to stay. He would not. Their relationship had been built on the foundation of choice, and he would be the last person to take that away from her. She looked at his proud, handsome profile against the fading light, and her heart felt as if it were being pulled in two. The path to her future lay in one direction, toward the rising sun and the cities of the East. The path to her heart lay here, in this small, resilient town, beside this quiet, honorable man. The choice was hers to make, and she did not know which one was right. The battle was won, but the fate of their own small, fragile peace was still undecided. The end of autumn settled onto the high plateau like a held breath. The vibrant golds of the aspens had faded, leaving the stark, elegant bones of the trees against a sky the color of washed steel. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the promise of the coming cold. For Abigail Moore, the future felt much the same way, a vast, clear, and intimidating expanse. The letter from the newspaper in Topeka was a constant weight in her pocket. It was a key, a passport to a world she had only ever dreamed of, a world where her voice could challenge injustice on a grand scale. Yet, every time she touched the crisp paper, her heart felt anchored to the dusty streets and the wide, open silences of mesquite wells. She had spent weeks helping the town find its feet. She worked with Marta, organizing the evening classes, her neat handwriting filling the pages of lesson books. She helped Nora establish a proper system for filing and record-keeping in the marshal's office, ensuring that the paper weapons Kate had used could never be so easily turned against the people again. She was a part of the community, woven into its newly resilient fabric, but the letter in her pocket reminded her that she was also a visitor, a traveler whose journey was supposed to continue. One morning, Atsa found her standing on the small rise overlooking the town, the letter in her hand. He did not ask what she was thinking. He did not need to. The conflict was plain to see on her face. He simply stood beside her, a quiet, solid presence against the vast landscape. "I am going back to my hogan for a few days," he said, his voice calm. "There is work to be done before the deep snows come. The winter wind is hard on an old door." He did not invite her. He did not ask her to come. He simply stated his plan, leaving the space between his words open for her to fill. It was, she realized, the greatest act of respect he could show her. He was giving her the freedom to choose, even if that choice led her away from him. "I will come with you," she said, the words surprising her with their certainty. "I need to see it again." The journey back to his small valley was different this time. They were not running from a storm or from men with guns. They walked in a comfortable silence, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. When they arrived, the hogan stood as it always had, a timeless mound of earth and timber that seemed to be listening to the whisper of the wind. It felt like coming home. The old door, made of rough-hewn planks, was warped and weathered. It closed, but it did not seal. The wind found its way through the cracks, a low, mournful whistle that spoke of the coming winter. "We will build a new one," Atsa said. "One that fits, one that will hold the warmth in." The work became a meditation. Atsa selected a dead seasoned pine, and with a skill that was both practical and artistic, he began to shape the wood. He used an axe and an adze, his movements efficient and powerful. He did not rush. He worked with the grain of the wood, not against it. Abigail found that she was not an observer, but a participant. He showed her how to use a draw knife to smooth the planks, how to measure and mark the cuts. Her hands, now healed and steady, grew confident with the tools. They worked together, side by side, building more than just a door. They were building a shared understanding, a silent partnership. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, eating the simple food they prepared, the warmth of the flames a comfort against the deepening chill of the nights. They did not speak of Topeka. They did not speak of the future. They spoke of the wood, of the shape of the sky, of the name of a particular star. They existed only in the quiet, meaningful present. On the third day, the door was finished. It was a solid, beautiful thing, the pine planks fitting together so perfectly that they seemed to be a single piece of wood. It had a new wooden latch and a sturdy bar that could be set from the inside. Together, they lifted it and set it into the frame. It swung smoothly on its leather hinges and closed with a soft, satisfying thud, sealing the hogan against the outside world. It was a boundary, a statement of sovereignty, a declaration of a safe and private space they had created together. That night, Abigail slept more deeply than she had in a year. The whistle of the wind was gone, replaced by a profound and peaceful silence. She woke just before dawn to a strange new light filtering through the smoke hole in the roof. Atsa was already awake, adding a log to the fire. She rose and went to the new door, lifting the latch. She opened it to a world transformed. A soft, gentle snow was falling. The first of the season, the flakes were large and perfect, drifting down from a silent, gray sky. They were not the driven, angry flakes of the blizzard that had nearly claimed her life. This was a quiet, cleansing snow, a benediction that was blanketing the world in a layer of pure, untroubled white. A shiver ran through her, a sudden, involuntary tremor. Atsa came to stand behind her in the doorway. He saw her shiver, and his dark eyes were full of a quiet question. She turned to him and smiled, a true, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "It is not because of the cold," she said, her voice soft. "It is because I am alive." The words were a revelation, a simple and profound truth she had not fully understood until that moment. She was not just a survivor. She was not just a fighter. She was alive, in this place, at this moment, and the sheer, unexpected beauty of it all was overwhelming. Atsa looked at her, and in his face she saw all the love and respect he held for her. He did not speak. He simply opened his arms. It was an invitation, a question, an offering of a safe harbor. And Abigail, with a heart that was suddenly, completely, and irrevocably certain, stepped into his embrace. She did not fall into his arms. She walked into them, a conscious and deliberate choice. He held her, and then he led her back to the fire. He sat on the sheepskins, his back against a support post, and she willingly, freely, settled into his lap, leaning back against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, and they sat together, watching the fire, the heart of their home. The memory of their first encounter hung in the air, a ghost now laid to rest. Then he had lifted her, a frozen, desperate creature, and laid her by the fire to save her life. Now, she had come to him, a whole and healed woman, and sat by his fire to begin a life. The warmth was no longer a frantic battle against death. It was the steady, peaceful glow of a shared future. "I am not going to Topeka," she said into the quiet. "My voice is needed here." He held her a little tighter. His voice was a low murmur against her hair. "We could make a good life here." "What kind of life?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He was silent for a moment, thinking, "I know the Dine. You know the words on the paper. There are many who do not trust the town, and many in the town who do not understand the Dine. We could build a bridge, a small trading post, here in this valley, a place where goods and words can be exchanged fairly. And the school," Abigail added, the idea taking root and blossoming in her mind. "Marta needs help. We could make it a bigger school, one for the Dine children, too, A place where they can learn English, and where the white children can learn about the dying. A bilingual school, a bridge made of children. He nodded, a slow, satisfied smile touching his lips. It was a good plan. It was a life of purpose, a life of healing, a life they would build together, just as they had built the door. They sat for a long time, watching the fire burn and the snow fall outside. The new door was closed and barred, secure against the storm. The fire was a warm, beating heart in the center of the hogan. The world outside was being renewed, the scars of the past covered in a blanket of gentle, promising white. The long fight was over. The winter was here, and they were finally home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Please comment and let us know where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.